Okay, we're going to start with a little clip and see how it works.
Is it true that you have written a number of very revolutionary poems, plays, and other writers? I have written a number of poems, songs, and plays in the fight against Hitler, and of course they can be considered therefore as revolutionary, because I, of course, was for the overthrow of that government.
I would like to ask Mr. Brecht whether or not he wrote a poem, a song entitled Forward, We've Not Forgotten. Forward, we've not forgotten our strength in the fight we have won. No matter what may threaten, forward, not forgotten. How strong we are as one. On the knees our hands now aching, built the roads, the walls, the towers. Did you write that, Mr. Brecht?
No, I wrote the German poem, but that is very different.
Are you now, have you ever been around the Communist Party of any country?
Mr. Chairman, I have heard my colleagues and they consider this question not as proper, but I am a guest in this country and do not want to enter in any legal arguments, so I will answer your question fully as well I can.
All right. This is perhaps the most famous instance of Bertolt Brecht addressing a live audience. The date is 30th of October 1947, and Brecht, as a writer whose leftist sympathies had not gone by unnoticed since his settlement in 1941 in California, has been summoned by McCarthy and his HUAC in Washington. In preparation of the hearing, Brecht had composed and distributed a rather elaborate speech that focused mainly on his career and artistic wager against Nazism. Carl E. Munt, and you saw him, he was that day presiding the committee's session, opened the proceedings by thanking Brecht for sharing his text in advance, but dissuaded Brecht from reading it. Munt judged that the speech Brecht had made ready was redundant, because only its last two paragraphs dealt with his activities in the USA, and precisely the latter were the committee's concern. It's with Brecht's practice of and reflection on public speaking that we wish to concern ourselves today. For not unlike the representatives of McCarthyism, the rather vast field of Brecht studies has by and large treated Brecht's own practice of public speaking as redundant. Brecht's speeches, in particular, have received very little attention. In the 30-volume Zuurkamp edition of his collected writings, moreover, the speeches Brecht prepared and delivered during his lifetime are not isolated as forming a genre of interest in its own right. One of the obvious reasons for this, it could be argued, is that Brecht speeched remarkably little during his fertile career. Indeed, scattered throughout the 30 volumes of his collected works, only a dozen drafts of speeches and only a dozen speeches proper can be isolated. The writer's speech, in short, would appear to be a very marginal phenomenon in Brecht's work. The neglect of Brecht's public address as a genre, however, might further be explained by generic issues. After all, what is the writer's speech? What criteria set it apart as a genre from other literary and non-literary text types, such as the essay or the interview? Intuitively, we all here could no doubt come up with a series of such criteria. But the very fact that we would be doing this intuitively points perhaps to a final reason why Brecht's speeches have been largely overlooked. In modernism studies at large, we so far have not subjected the phenomenon of the writer's speech to serious scrutiny. Here too it surfaces as a side issue. Now our intention today is to argue that the author's public address in Brecht as well as in modernism at large, is something or anything but redundant. Quite the opposite. The writer's speech is of key importance to an understanding of Brecht's entire oeuvre, and it is of equal significance to grasp more generally the relationship between modernism and rhetoric. So, here we go. To isolate the aesthetic of public address Brecht developed from the 1920s onward, and to determine its relevance within Brecht's more encompassing oeuvre, we first need to pause at the forms of public speech he found wanting. Like many of his generation, Brecht never failed to note how tired he had grown of the rhetorical, declamatory style that had become dominant since the late 19th century. I quote, "All words within the assigned mood, a sort of programmatic stuffed words in apple sauce," end quote. Like many of his modernist contemporaries, Brecht further avidly commented on fellow writers who spoke in public. Such was the case, for instance, when Thomas Mann, whose speeches in German modernism have perhaps received the most attention, in April 1920 publicly read from his novel Magic Mountain. Brecht ridiculed the clear commercial aspect of Mann's live performance, but also could not help but observe how the novelist's finely chiseled language was totally off-key. In a rare moment of kindness towards Thomas Mann, he noted how the author's eloquent sentences got completely lost in the racket his audience produced, to the extent that it set Mann off balance. The refined manners of literary writing, Brecht thus suggested, no longer proved to be an effective mode of public address if art, as Brecht desired, was to impact the masses. More efficient, yet equally superseded, was the rhetorical apparatus employed by expressionist dramatist Georg Kaiser. In an essay entitled Über das Rhetorische, on the rhetorical of 1920, Brecht commented on Kaiser's seemingly countless public speeches. You have the translation here. "Characteristic of our time is the renaissance of rhetoric, that is, pathetic rhetoric. Georg Kaiser these days is learning to speak in public, and the word used here is reden. He is like the never-ending, redselig orator Willem of German drama. All in all, he is touching. His efforts are even laudable. In this, he resembles Demosthenes. Like him, Kaiser has difficulty learning it. He stutters, says everything 2-3 times, and falls back on shouting as loud as possible. Yet instead of going to the lonely sea, he goes to the theater." An endless bombardment of rhetorical commonplaces, Brecht continued, mocked Kaiser's mounting the platform of public speech. That he likened Kaiser in this context to Emperor Wilhelm II was no coincidence. The former emperor was known to a broader audience, especially for his long-windedness, after he had traveled throughout the country to address his people in person. Above all, Brecht noted, Georg Kaiser had nothing to say. His hollow display of words was a slap in the face of intellectualism. The traditional rhetorical pathos writers had begun to copy from bygone political icons, and the late 19th century theatre, in the end, does prove as undesirable to Brecht as Thomas Mann's aesthetic subtlety. Even so, as the fragile Weimar Republic toppled into the Third Reich, and later, during his exile in the USA, Brecht came to notice just how strongly the renaissance of rhetorical pathos manifested itself, above all, in political speech. Closely monitoring the strategies of public address deployed by Nazi officials in particular, and studying attentively their system of rhetorical composition, Brecht realized that Nazi argumentation, while not entirely devoid of logic, evolved mainly through syllabi. Pretending to develop an argument, Nazi officials, above all, let apodictic sentences pass for rational logic. And a good example is the following oration by Joseph Goebbels from 1933, which is further marked by the abusive use of language so characteristic of many Nazi speeches. Such use of language was largely opposed by Brecht, whose own speeches hardly ever fell prey to verbal vituperation, not even when it came to the Nazis. So it's a very short clip for the telling of what he opposed.
Eine gute Regierung ohne Propaganda kann ebenso wenig bestehen wie
Yet it was not just brutality and syllogistic rhetorical composition that made up the Nazi speech observed. If anything, it was the same pathos that had characterized Georg Kaiser's addresses. In Brecht's Nachlass, we find a great variety of photographs and newspaper clippings, mainly from the Völkischen Beobachter, that capture the histrionics of Hitler while speaking in public. Such evidence shows that Brecht also paid ample attention to the role of the body in performances of the speech. Noting how artificial and ridiculous Hitler's bodily comportment was, Brecht concluded that Hitler's style was as grotesque, a grotesque version of old rhetorical models. And indeed, it is well known that Hitler in Munich had taken lessons from an old-school acting instructor who had taught him to rehearse and make look natural a canon of gestures and poses as well as set modes of pronunciation. Still, Brecht had to admit, these old histrionic models added to a powerful cocktail endowing Hitler with a magical, charismatic persona, a perverted variant of Max Weber's charismatic authority. Let us calmly study how he makes use of the artistic means of empathy, Einfühlung. Let us consider what devices he employs. By means of a battery of old tricks, the expectations of his spectators, for the people is to become a spectatorship, are formed and raised. The message has been spread that with Hitler, one never knows in advance what the orator will be saying. And then he speaks. Not in the name of the people. He speaks brutally, but does not report what the people has to say. He is the unique individual, the Einzelperson, the author in the drama, and he moves the people, or rather the spectatorship, to repeat his words. He makes his audience delve into himself, wraps it up in his movements, allows it to take part in his words. Hence, it was the combination of a rhetorical reasoning without reason on the one hand, and an embodied classic histrionic delivery on the other hand, that made Hitler's speeches so effective and deceptive. Hitler's public address and bodily kinetics imbibed his audience. The Nazi rise to power, Brecht also noted, was very much facilitated precisely by their art of public speaking. For significantly, whenever analyzing Nazi politics, Brecht quite consistently turned to the regime's speeches and not to its published ideological tracts. However close Brecht drew the speeches of artists and politicians, we should not forget, of course, that Brecht throughout his career remained an artist and not a propagandist. While this is not the place to rehearse Brecht's general aesthetic, it is worth reiterating that his art always defined itself against, and I quote, socially concerned naturalism, reportage, official socialist realism, propaganda, and agitprop, end quote. Brecht was a Socratic teacher, you could say, and an artist in one. Only by artistic and not by artificial means did he intervene in given modes of thought. It was through his work that he wished to challenge and prompt his audience to look at things differently, and his tools were those of the theatre, not politics. As he put it humbly himself in a 1951 speech for the first writers' conference of the recently founded Gilleir, and again I quote, "My profession, that of theatre, is but one area of culture and not even the most important one," end quote. This is not to say, of course, that Brecht ever undervalued the social significance of his work. Even in the last speech he gave, or he was to deliver, in January 1956, he stressed the singular role of art in society, that is, to install a better way of reasoning among the masses, to show rather than to tell the general public how change was possible and imminent. And now, because not many speeches of Brecht are preserved in recorded form, we'd like to play a short patch from the mentioned speech, the Gilleir one. It takes about 3 minutes. We'd like to draw your attention especially to the calm and neutral, undramatic, if you want, yet not boring tone of his delivery.
aus der Rede Brechts auf dem Deutschen Schriftstellerkongress 1956.
In dem Teil Deutschlands, in dem dieser Kongress tagt, wird im Interesse ganz Deutschlands der Kampf um eine neue, bessere Lebensweise und um eine neue, bessere Denkweise mächtig fortgeführt werden. Wir werden ihn auf allen Gebieten, mit allen Mitteln führen, auf dem Gebiet der Künste mit allen Kunstmitteln. Immer noch lebt der größere Teil Deutschlands im Sumpf der bürgerlichen Barbarei und der Sumpf steigt wieder. Jubelnd begrüßen in Friedland Sprecher des Großbürgertums jene Unglücklichen, die es einst zu Wölfen erzogen hat, während es schon wieder Unglückliche in einem neuen Überfallsheer abrichtet.
Sorry, we get the gist of it. Art had to follow its own rules, to find legitimacy for itself as art, but with a clear purpose, to offer the modern masses possibilities for change. Unsurprisingly, given Brecht's general aesthetic, the striking similarities he observed between the public address in his domain and that of politics seems to have sparked an interest in exploring an alternative mode of public address. We can even go so far as to state that Brecht's reflection on the speech suggested a name for this alternative type of public address, Sagen. Brecht most often used the verb reden and the noun rede in a pejorative sense. When asked to take part in a survey on the role of art in 1934 by the Pariser Tageblatt, however, Brecht interestingly foregrounded the verb sagen, to say, as a possible alternative. The Pariser Tageblatt had launched the survey on the occasion of Hitler's speech Kultur und Eigentum, delivered on the 1st of September 1933. What did the practitioners in culture in Germany make of this speech? In response, Brecht, in contrast with Hitler's Rede, minced his words carefully. We must say that people will be tortured, while the distribution of wealth will remain the same. To say the good, one must be able to listen well and to hear the good. The truth has to be said cunningly, at least, and to be heard cunningly. And for us writers, it's important to whom we say this and who says it. Brecht's projected writer's speech, then, was to say the truth in an artful manner, and not, as his contemporaries did, to artificially draw attention away from it. Admittedly, Brecht never put forth an aesthetic of public address in the same didactic manner characteristic of his writings on epic theatre from the mid-1930s onward. He never sat down to write an organum of the speech. Yet it is quite possible to reconstruct such an aesthetic when we attentively go through his speeches and reflections on the genre. For it would seem that in Brecht's view, three principal conditions had to be met for a speech to be truly effective if it was to counter the renaissance of rhetorical pathos. First, as we already saw, the speech would have to address the truth. In line with his entire oeuvre, this implied a making felt of the mechanisms, strategies, and outgrowths of capitalism that affected people's everyday lives. Second, Second, the empathy, or Einfühlung, so typical of conventional theatre as well as of Hitler's speeches, clearly had to be avoided. As Brecht argued in a public address of 1939, empathy is the aesthetic device of our epoch, in which man is considered the numerical variable and the world he lives in the constant. It is not hard, therefore, to understand that abandoning empathy is of the utmost importance, if not the greatest experiment conceivable. This was a view Brecht defended throughout his career. Empathy was bête noire because it presented people only with illusions, allowing a momentary escape from a society that was thought to be unbearable yet unchangeable. the constant. People listening to and viewing Hitler's speeches were moved much like theatergoers were by actors' conventional methods. They identified with fictional characters, or even Hitler, as if their fate was in no way different from that of characters. They thereby failed to recognize their own agency in the theatrical performance, and thus also within society at large. As such, the audience had to be detached from the orator and was to be recognized as such, an entity in and of itself, free to act, yet dialectically involved in a more encompassing social process. And finally, and closely tied to this, the new orator was to draw attention to his role as orator. To this end, he was not to fall back on traditional forms of aesthetic artifice, such as the rhetorical commonplaces set to work by Kaiser. Instead, he was to fix attention on the artifice of the public address itself, so as to block empathy. Self-irony and comedy seem to have been the first impolite tactics here, for what Kaiser as well as Hitler shared was a misplaced presumption of authority in art and politics that forewent their speeches. Georg Kaiser, Brecht had observed, seemed to pride himself on being a great artist and intellectual, while in actuality he never said anything. Hitler, in a similar vein, considered himself a genius in the domain of politics. Creating a distance, through irony therefore, would have been one way to avoid it. Similarly, the orator was to create space between his message and himself by reflecting on the message in the open. As Brecht noted in his Rede über die Widerstandskraft der Vernunft, so the speech on the oppositional force of reason, of 1937, Nazi speeches, and I quote, bestially denunciated the intellect, end quote. In light of his strong belief in humanity's capacity for reason, the true orator was thus also to reason out loud, to offer his audience information in a detached manner so that the audience in turn could judge for itself. Unlike in the speeches of Hitler, an actual logic, this was to be made explicit, it seems, similar to Brecht's so-called fixing of the not-but element in drama, by means of which characters made their choices public. So characters would say, I could now do this, not, but, and so they would think out loud about their actions. Hence, just as the good speech was to sever the rhetorical ties between audience and narrator, so the orator was to detach himself from the message he conveyed and to foreground the speech context, not through traditional histrionics and modes of embodiment, but through an attempt at a more impersonal, if not rhetorically disembodied form of address. Indeed, even the art of declamation will have to be altered. As Brecht put it, and again I quote, I propagate an open, unpriestly declamation, which avoids sonorous cadences, crescendo, and tremolos, end quote. The role of the speaker's voice and body too then had to be downplayed, almost to the point of reaching a sort of degré zéro of recitation. In sum, if the public speech traditionally had been designed and performed in such a way that it boiled down to a plain monologue, the detachment of audience and orator as well as of orator and message were meant to install a dialogic and dialectic process. When taken together, the three criteria isolated here indicate that Brecht's implicit aesthetic of public address explored the potential of the genre as a dialectical mode of thought and interventionist art, as he called his work always, not unlike the one proposed by his epic theatre. Like Brecht's theatrical work, the speech was to cause verfremdung, on the basis of a separation of elements which could then be enrolled in a dialectical play. The few speeches Brecht prepared for actual delivery by himself, almost without exception, proved weak versions of the projected poetic. When leafing through the remaining typescripts of Brecht's speeches, it becomes instantly clear how attentively he prepared his addresses. For example, the typed version of the speech he delivered on 23 of June 1935 in Paris for the First International Congress of Writers is marked by carefully handwritten indications of pauses and emphases. However, despite such meticulous preparation, which was of course not uncommon, many of the speeches Brecht actually performed strike as eminently didactic and they frequently make use of either repetition, rhetorical questions, or emphatic apostrophes to address his audience as a collective. We saw it at the beginning, we have heard it, Kameraden. In short, all rhetorical devices he disliked in others. Admittedly, Brecht tried to use these commonplaces to actively involve his audience in his reasoning about society. For instance, in his 1954 public address entitled Ein Vorschlag, and read at the World Peace Conference in Berlin, he dealt with the not-so-minor threat of atomic pollution. First came a series of questions calling upon his listeners to reflect for themselves. I quote, "How shall we go about this? How shall we battle pure ignorance? How can we relive the horror in our imagination blunted by 2 world wars?" Unquote. Inverting the propagandistic strategies of politics and humbly approaching his audience, he would always say during his speech, "I think, ich meine," but it's just a thought, it's just a proposition or a proposal. Brecht then went on to suggest that the best way to spread the news about the risk of atomic pollution was not top-down mass notification through the press and propaganda, but mouth-to-mouth, bottom-up communication. All individual members of his audience were simply to raise this problem with their neighbors. The facts would speak for themselves and would not, as the Nazis had always done, have to be sold as truth to the people by a government. Ein Vorschlag is an exception, however, in that it is the only speech in which Brecht actually addresses his audience as a group of individuals. Other texts he read to a live audience in person proved not as successful at separating and then engaging the audience dialectically. That Brecht's own speeches proved weak versions of his projected aesthetic Sagen has several reasons. To begin with, it appears that Brecht often speaks out of necessity. It was a series of speeches in Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, to an audience reported to have been only mildly enthusiastic and interested, that enabled his migration out of Germany. Likewise, he often talked upon a request for explanation. Brecht was frequently asked to expound on his theory of theatre, for instance. It was also a speech explaining his activities before the House of Un-American Activities Committee that in part gave him room to operate somewhat freely in the USA. So all these circumstances then were not ideal for trying out innovative modes of public address, I imagine, right? When you are in front of a kulak, you would want to come across as a normal human being and not experiment with speech. They demanded these circumstances a conventional address in which the speaker would have been bound by limitations built into the genre. Everything further suggests that Brecht simply disliked speeching in public. It stands beyond doubt that Brecht, during various phases of his career, could have speech every night if he had wanted to, yet he did not. This did not go by unnoticed in the press either. As a GDR journalist of Der Morgen in '51 noted, after Brecht had spoken at a large conference, and again I quote, "Brecht, who met with tempestuous applause, only rarely speaks at large events like these." Unquote. Brecht's reticence to speak ex cathedra stands in sharp contrast to the fact that he far more often lent his voice for dialogic interviews. Werner Hecht, who compiled a great amount of conversations with Brecht, has claimed that Brecht excelled in thinking out loud in such dialogic constellations. His aesthetic of eingreifendes Denken, of intervening in others' thought, Hecht observed, in fact required the provocation and potential retort free conversation allowed for. And then, of course, finally, Brecht seems to have realized that he himself was in a bad place to act as the impersonal, disembodied orator, no matter how hard he tried to avoid emphatic declamation. It had always been his aim to reach the masses with his art, and he had proven very successful at this. But this went at a cost. His first plays and role as a critic earned him considerable authority in the cultural realm. By the late 1920s, Brecht had become a sort of celebrity in Germany, and it's worth noting too that his celebrity status was partly continued in the USA. The Hua hearing, for example, was attended by a considerable amount of press representatives. Brecht, as a person then, with his almost iconic facial features to us today, could never fully be separated from the author function, to use Foucault's term, which forewent his message. The fact that he gave few speeches thus also evinces how consequential he was when he came to his implied aesthetic of public address. Yet Brecht did not consider the speech a genre that had been so thoroughly tarnished and tainted, abused to such an extent in both art and politics, that he had to keep clear of it altogether. The circumstances in which he operated and his renown may have stood in the way of performing Sagen himself as a body in front of a live audience. He nonetheless seriously contemplated an alternative art of public address. And nowhere is this made clearer than in his parallel speeches and reflection on radio, to which we presently turn, and in the role of the speech in his drama, at which we will subsequently look at.
Well, first the radio. It took Brecht only a couple of years to gain access to the medium of radio after its first official broadcast in 1923 in Germany. In the late 1920s, he would write or adapt a number of plays for the radio. Mann ist Mann, March 27, Macbeth, October 27, and the Lindenberg-Flug, multiple broadcasts in 1929. And throughout the 1920s, but also later during his exile in Moscow and in Spain, he would lend his voice to a number of speeches. Brecht shared the enthusiasm of many contemporaries who hailed the medium as excitingly new. It was an unprecedented invention, he claimed on many occasions, one that could instantly reach a mass audience. Very soon, however, it had become obvious that radio was put to use in inherently old-fashioned, if not jejune ways. The radio was, quote, not a fashionable, but a truly modern phenomenon, unquote. Yet old forms, and not least the old modes of public address, occupied this new media space. In fact, the same voices that could be heard on the streets and in auditoria figured on the radio as well, performing the same traditional tricks. This was not surprising, Brecht claimed, because writers soon found out that there was money to be made from appearing on the radio for doing just the same things always. On the occasion of one of Gottfried Benn's radio speeches, for example, Brecht sarcastically noted, quote, and he's at his best when he's sarcastic, when radio was invented and lectures on rabbit feeding or marine life research soon proved to be well paid, our poet, Ben, was taken over by a strong urge to teach. He produced some dark theories for the radio about humanity, about the fall of tradition, etc., that one best reads in the old, beautiful fashion. Used for educational entertainment and not least for political purposes, the potential of the medium radio for transforming the art of public speaking was thus left unexploited by writers and artists. Conspicuous for Brecht was that everyone appeared to reduce radio to a unidirectional medium, while in actual fact it worked in two ways. There was a speaker, a voice, yes, obviously, but there was also a heterogeneous audience of listeners. Radio performers simply failed to challenge the desires and needs of that audience. They subjected the medium to, quote, already worn out and old needs. Radio, Brecht says, is one-sided when it should be two. It is purely an apparatus for distribution, for mere sharing out. So here's a positive suggestion. Change this apparatus over from distribution to communication. The radio would be the finest possible communication apparatus in public life, a vast network of pipes. That is to say, it would be if it knew how to receive as well as transmit, how to let the listener speak as well as hear, how to bring him into a relationship instead of isolating him. On this principle, the radio should step out of the supply business and organize its listeners as suppliers. On the surface, Brecht's observation amounted to little more than a statement about the economic logic at work in radio production. Radio makers simply treated their audience as mute consumers, as one would with any other commodity. That was certainly what he was saying, but he further implied that radio makers did not see, they had no audience whatsoever, at least not an active audience that truly participated in broadcasts. Quote, the simple state of hearing does not create a collective. And so what Brecht called for, or what he thought needed to be called for, were alternative forms and formats, to which people would actually commit themselves through active listening rather than merely registering. The monologic Rede, as could be expected, did not rank among the forms Brecht valued here. For radio makers were to stop using the medium as a simple megaphone, and instead they were to go down into the streets and the theatres. They could broadcast from Parliament, they should do interviews and air debates. The idea of an acoustic novel was to be explored, and of course, as Brecht was to do himself, alternative dramatic forms as well had to be experimented with. The biggest challenge facing all these endeavors was the separation of the audience. How indeed could the audience be actively engaged? As a whole, it could never come to speak physically itself, so radio, Brecht suggested, was to move thought and information from speaker to public and back, in the process also taking into account somehow what listeners were or could be experiencing. To achieve this, radio makers were to give shape to an audience, yet not by departing from any preconceived notion of the public, for this is exactly what the Rede did and what Joseph Goebbels' radio propaganda would come to do on a massive scale. Instead, the radio maker was to rope in with the individual members of his audience in such a way that those individuals would be recognized with a certain dignity, that is, as separate agents engaged in a larger dialectical process in which they form part of an active collective. The instruments radio makers had at their disposal for this were language and voice, music and sound more generally. The body, as an instrument of dramatic display, was no longer available. But the medium's audience too was different from that of the old Rede performed in person to a live audience. The audience too was somehow disembodied or dismembered, for the public radio was in a multiplicity of places, from households and cafes to offices and factories. The speech context, in brief, was such that a radio voice was de facto always addressing a group of individuals spread throughout the public space, and when addressed as such, these individuals could also be involved in collective reflection, if not action. As before then, Reden was out, Sagen conspicuously was not. Brecht's speeches on radio, in fact, proved to have been much stronger versions of Sagen than in the few addresses he uttered in person to a live audience. His Rede im Rundfunk, from a radio speech from 1927, offers a rich and rewarding example. While no recording of this speech survives, its script has been preserved because it was printed, possibly after minor amendments, first in the Berliner Börsenkurier in March, and subsequently in various other papers and journals, always under the title either Vorrede or Vorrede zu Mann ist Mann. As the latter title suggests, Brecht's speech was intended as an introduction to his first radio play, Mann ist Mann, which was broadcast immediately after his speech, and we will come back to that in a minute. Two other drafts of the speech survive, which are remarkably different from the one eventually aired. These other designs are interesting because they illustrate how Brecht was trying out different rhetorical and narrative techniques, as well as divergent topical approaches before making up his mind. Yet nothing quite prepares us for the radio speech Brecht actually delivered for Rede im Rundfunk is the most biologic speech Brecht ever wrote and delivered himself. The text is structured in three rhetorical parts. The first part is a sweeping display of Brecht's vision of the future. It opens with a query that instantly involves the audience, and I quote, "You see, our plays in part deal with new things that emerged long before the Great War. This also means, however, that they no longer deal with older things to which we have grown accustomed. Why do our plays no longer comprise these elements that were once appreciated and thought of as important? That, I believe, I can tell you with precision." Brecht goes on then to explain that the people who once cared about these old things in theatre, clearly it means bourgeoisie, are on the decline. Their imagination and their creative powers are waning. Yet a new type of human being is emerging today, a being that is in creative control of machines and no longer enslaved by them. Brecht, in his speech, takes considerable time to expand on this idea of this new type of man, but then he suddenly aborts this grand narrative and goes on to the second part of his speech, which turns out to be the play, Mann ist Mann. The play listeners are about to hear, he claims, does not deal with all aspects of the future, just projected. Yet, however, quote, I thought that many things in the play, a man is man, and especially that what the protagonist, your packer Gilleir, does and doesn't do, might estrange you. And because of that, it is better that you imagine not to hear an old acquaintance of yours talking about himself, as has so far been the custom in theatre. Rather, imagine a new type, or maybe a forerunner of this new type of human being, about which I just spoke. The main character of Man ist Man, the packer Gilleir, is not just a man of the, is not a man of the Rede. He talks in an entirely new way, which also requires a new attitude from the listener. In every sentence hereafter, Brecht addresses listeners, prodding their imagination and common sense, and constantly says, you might think, you're probably thinking, you're used to thinking this and that. Brecht, in doing so, describes his hero as the Gilleir, an opportunist who can adapt to all circumstances. A man without an opinion of his own is the man who can't say no. And a character who always says yes. For all these reasons, Brecht argues, you, listener, might think he's weak. But Gilleir is not a weakling, quite the opposite. He's the strongest. And this becomes very clear when he stops being a private person. He first becomes strong as part of the masses. In the final concluding section of this speech, Brecht suggests that the listener might lament that circumstances forced Gilleir to give up his so-called priceless self. Yet this is not the case, Brecht concludes. In fact, it is a wonderful affair. Gilleir does not get hurt and he wins, and such a man, Brecht says, should thrive. Then come the final sentences, quote, yet perhaps you are of another opinion, to which I might at least have some objections, end quote. Many things are striking about Brecht's radio address. First, there is its understated use of rhetorical figures. He uses remarkably few rhetorical tropes, and he opts instead for a neutral mode that comes very close to everyday language. As one critic observed in the journal Funkstunde, shortly after Brecht had read the speech, what struck above all was Brecht's precise choice of words. All the more striking, therefore, is the degree of indeterminacy the speech simultaneously set up. The links between the speech's first and second part, for example, are loose, thus introducing what Wolfgang Iser might have called Leerstelle, implied connections that activate the listener's participation. Brecht's speech also leaves open alternatives, and it invites debate in the end. The listener is to decide for him or herself, is giving up one's precious, illusionary individuality in a struggle for survival and merging with the masses in that struggle a good thing, or is it not? Striking here, finally, is a dialogue Brecht sets up between himself and his audience, addressing each of its particular parts individually and inviting or suggesting it to think outside the box as a collective. In the process, he constantly draws attention to the speech context of the radio transmission, not so much by referring to its technological aspects, although it's clearly implied that the radio was, as a machine tool, will be subservient to its projected new man. Instead, however, his speech constantly draws a line between speaker and listener by naming and thus separating both. As a form of Sagen, in short, Brecht's Rede im Rundfunk proves much more consistent than the speeches he delivered in person to a live audience. This is not simply due to the alternative and open way of reasoning it introduces. It is as such due to an aesthetic operation which strips the traditional rhetorical makeup of the Rede to the bone. The medium of radio itself, as well, seems to add to the success of the speech. For, in a way, the medium separated audience and speaker for Brecht, while at the same time disembodying the speaker. Indeed, Brecht might have realized, as we saw, that as an authority and later as a celebrity, he was in a bad position to deliver his projected alternative to the Rede. As a speaker on the radio, however, he was no longer the full physical presence he found wanting, but reduced to a voice addressing his audience undramatically. That said, Brecht also delivered few radio speeches, which appears to suggest that he did not consider the radio as the ideal channel for the art of Sagen either. And indeed, if we could go on, final step further and turn to the countless speeches we find in his work for the theatre. This is on the stage and not on the radio. It is there that Brecht will eventually come to the real art of Sagen. On the stage, Brecht is the ventriloquist. With Brecht, nothing ever seems to be coincidental. That Mann ist Mann, a play that had premiered a year earlier on stage in 1926, was to be Brecht's first radio play as well, appears as anything but contingent. Inspired by Rudyard Kipling, Ivan Goll and many others, Mann ist Mann is a parable that basically addresses the equality, but also the exchangeability of all identities. Many characters in the play undergo a change of identity, and even sex. This was Brecht's way of suggesting that under capitalism, identity is little more than a commodity, and that the supposed individuality of subjects was of course an illusion. From this perspective, it is perhaps not so coincidental that this play was the first to be aired on the radio, a medium, as we saw, that fractures the traditional audience of the speech into a group of individual listeners, a scattered collective. For this too is what happens in the play. As it progresses, it becomes clear that what truly defines subjects is in fact a collective, the social constellation in which they are involved. As such, a man is man is also in part a meta-reflection on radio as a means of communication. Simultaneously, this early play was one of the first to display many of the characteristics that were to become defining of Brecht's epic theatre, such as the use of songs to interrupt the action and the destruction of the theatre's fourth wall, among others, by actors' direct address to the public. Mann ist Mann, for example, also houses one of the first so-called Zwischensprüche, intermezzo talks or speeches, in which an orator, cum narrator, intervenes and approaches the live audience without mediation. In the play, as it premiered on stage in 1926, an actor, after the 8th scene, came up as a stage directions read, quote, next to the portrait of Mr. Bertolt Brecht, claiming that Brecht, the playwright, had so far proven that one could do an awful lot to and with people. Here tonight, this man looked like an automobile, without a man losing anything whatsoever. The audience was then invited to let go of its individuality and to adapt to a more hostile world evoked from a subsequent scene onward. However, for the radio broadcast of the play in 1927, where no portrait of the playwright could be shown, Brecht in person delivered the Zwischenspruch. The complex irony of this act will be clear. Not only did Brecht's intermediate speech draw attention to the artificiality of the performance and the medium of the radio, thereby estranging the audience, it further drove a wedge between Brecht's voice and his auto-function because it was Brecht appearing as the character Brecht who was now addressing listeners. As a speaker here, Brecht, as it were, came to exit his own body, contemplating it from the outside while making his voice or speech a mere instrument of authorial intention. It would take us too far to sketch the many well-studied speeches Brecht from this point onward was to introduce in his theatrical work. But it should at least be hypothesized that as a genre within his more encompassing aesthetic of theatre, such speeches might have proven impossible without this reflection on Sagen. Brecht soon seems to have realized that he could actually speak far more effectively in public without saying a word himself. Instead, he could have actors perform a polyphony of speeches he merely was to direct, almost like a ventriloquist. Brecht would go on to develop not only a new type of declamation, but also his own alternative to traditional histrionics and bodily comportment of actors cum orators. He would therefore come to see that within the semi-fictional universe his play opened up onto, orators were by no means restricted by the inbuilt confines of a normal public address, and that various speeches could in fact be combined in fully focused wholes. Thus, one character could hold a speech and defend a certain style and an opinion diametrically opposed to that of another character's speech. Perhaps the most famous instance of this, and certainly one that ties together all the issues we've been addressing here, is his play Der aufhaltsame Aufstieg des Arthur Louis, The Resistible Rise of Arthur Louis from 1941. A harsh satirical allegory of Hitler's rise to power, this play stages several orators. Of course, there is Arthur Louis, the protagonist, performing speeches in the old-fashioned manner so much despised by Brecht. There is the orator cum narrator who frames the whole play in yet another way of speeches, and so on and so on. That speeches in Brecht's work for the theatre abound, and that here the genre is exploited to the maximum as an artistic mode of address should not come as a surprise. For, as he made clear in the earlier quoted response in the Pariser Tageblatt's inquiry into the artist's opinion about Hitler's Rede from 1922, Sagen in theatre was a particularly powerful instrument for dismantling what had been considered as truth. Shakespeare, Brecht suggested in a response, already knew this when in Coriolanus he introduced the protagonist's mother very weak and unconvincing speech, thereby blocking the audience identification with her lies. Similarly, in Shakespeare, the tragedy of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony's subtle and elegant speech over Caesar's corpse could show the audience how, in mimicking Caesar's art of address, Mark Antony manipulated the masses as well as the truth. It had many ways. It had always been the orator in the theatre then that the audience was to lend its ears, and it was in drama, therefore, that Brecht himself was to perfect the art of the Sagen.
All right, let us conclude with a brief note. Modernism is commonly defined, in the words of Charlie Altieri, as a war on rhetoric. It was against conventional and ossified forms of speech that modernism pitted its own and new art of writing, as Jean Paulhan was to deplore in Flowers and Torrents. This is no doubt true, and modernism studies has been particularly good at analyzing the alternatives to rhetoric high modernist writing does supposedly develop. Yet such analyses to this day remain somewhat weak because they tend to fall short in describing what then exactly was the rhetoric modernism opposed. If rhetoric is first and foremost a toolkit, a system for persuasion, then the public address is perhaps the rhetorical gesture par excellence. Like many of his generation, Brecht was suspicious of the way in which rhetoric was used and abused, and not unlike many modernist contemporaries, he further defined his art in stark opposition to such abuse. Pitting his work against the ornamental tropes in conventional artistic exposés, as well as against the oratorical histrionics of political speakers like Hitler, Brecht went on to develop an alternative model of his own. In this respect, he was quite singular. Not many modernists were in fact so consistent as Brecht was. While it is possible to read much, if not most, of high modernist poetry and writing as the written record of a design for an alternative, idiosyncratic system of public address, very few modernists went as far as Brecht to actually also practice such an alternative model. One could think here of the Italian futurist art of declamation put forth by F.T. Marinetti during the Great War, and a handful of other examples, including the great Count Kraus, Baum perhaps, but the list is not endless. In fact, most modernists fell back on the rhetorical stock when they themselves had to address an audience in public addresses. And address such an audience they did. For German modernism, there is only one book-length comparative study that we are aware of that actually scrutinizes the modernist writer's speech. And the volume in question notably limits its scope to the 5 years succeeding the Second World War. Now, Cyril here, who's about to talk after us, his research so far into speeches delivered by German modernists during the interwar period has yielded a list of no less than, what is it now, 1,500? 1,300 speeches performed by about 100 writers. Most of these speeches delivered by high modernist luminaries like Robert Musil, Alfred Döblin, and the mentioned Gottfried Benn or Thomas Mann strike as eminently conventional in rhetorical terms. What is more, many of these public addresses continued in afterlife in a rewritten essay form, and some of these essays today rank among the most important writings in modernist poetics. The writer's speech, in short, deserves to be taken more seriously in future research, for it seems to suggest that at least in one way our common understanding of the relationship between modernism and rhetoric is fundamentally flawed. If anything, the writer's speech suggests that modernism's complex aesthetic of writing very often began in the most rhetorical of modes, with writers putting to an audience in conventional terms what their allegedly anti-rhetorical work was all about. And Brecht, in this respect, will always remain one of the few exceptions to the rule, a flash of lightning, if you want, that estranges us all from the fictions we've come to take for truths. Thank you.